In this lesson, I'm going to cover user access control. This was a technology introduced in Windows Vista, and the goal of it was to help protect administrators really from themselves. For example, an administrative credential has a lot of privilege. They can really perform any action on the system. And often problems occur because of a mistake. So if a user makes a mistake, maybe they can delete some of their local data, but they can't really perform any actions that would damage a server or the Active Directory. If I'm logged on as a domain administrator and make a mistake, I could wipe out an entire grouping of users, an entire file system. And so the best practice was always administrators should use two accounts. One, their administrator account, and then two, a normal user account. And they should always be logged on as the normal user account for their day-to-day activities. And then when they need their administrative credentials, they would do a run as to run a particular program or action using their administrative powers. The reality is organizations did not do this. Everyone would log on as their domain admin account. And so what the Windows Vista user access control technology did was even when I log on as an administrator, it really creates two tokens. A token represents my privileges, my capabilities. A user token with a restricted set of capabilities, and then my administrative token with all my powers. And it would actually use my user token for all of the activities I was doing day to day. And then it would prompt me for my administrative token if I tried to perform an activity that needed this. So for example, on my Windows 8 machine, there are many things I may want to do. So if I open up, for example, settings, control panel, and let's say date and time. If I want to change the date and time, you'll notice there's this shield icon. Anytime you see a shield icon, it means it needs to elevate your privilege, i.e. access your administrative token. So it's then accessing that token. Now to control my prompting in user accounts, I can say change user access control settings. So by default, I have it set to not notify me. The default is this, always notify me. Click OK. And that prompt you just saw is that UAC prompt. It's requesting your permission to use your token. Now what's important is, again by default, I'm not going to use that administrative power. So for example, if I just launch PowerShell here, it's just starting this under my user credentials, so it appears to work, but many commands would not actually function because I'm not an administrator. What I actually need to do is, if I right click, I don't see an option, but if I press Shift and right click, I can say Run as Administrator. It's asking me, hey, do you want to access your administrative credential? I say yes, and now what I'll see is Administrator : That tells me I'm using my administrative capabilities, and that's what you're going to need a lot of the time to perform administrative functions. So if you're using PowerShell or Command Prompt, you'll need to launch it with administrative privileges. There is a quick way to launch, for example, a Command Prompt. If I take my mouse to the bottom left corner and I see my Start button, if I right click, I get this nice menu and I can say launch a Command Prompt with admin credentials. Again, it's prompting me now because I turned on that prompting. And I'm now running again Administrator : That's how you know if you're running with that administrative credential. Now, when you're logged onto a server, you'll see that I never get prompt for these things. If I just launch PowerShell Integrated Scripting Environment, it's running as administrator. I didn't have to do Shift Run as Administrator. The reason is by default for administrative accounts, if I go into my local security policy, so I access that on the start screen, if I just type policy, there's my local security policy. Go back to my desktop. Under local policies, security options, there's a user access control admin approval for the built-in administrator account, which is what I'm using. By default, this is disabled, which means UAC is not running for my local administrator account, which is why I don't get any prompts. If you want it to be enabled, if you want UAC to be in effect even for the built-in accounts, you could set this to enabled, and then they would get those prompts. But this is why I don't see those interactions when I'm using a built-in admin account. It's actually disabled UAC. Now, it may be tempting to go and actually just disable UAC. If you remember on my Windows 8 environment, what I'd actually done is configured it to not notify me. So it's still using UAC. It still shows me the shield icon, but it wasn't prompting me. That's really the minimal level you should ever set this at. So it'll let me know if an app tries to do something, but it's not dimming my desktop. Even if you say never notify, in Windows 7, this would actually turn off user access control. This is not turning off user access control. What it's actually doing on this bottom level is it will never prompt you, but it's still being used behind the scenes. It's just that when an application requests your administrative credential, it's just given it without you having to approve it. Now, this may seem like the same functionality as Windows 7, but the reality isn't, because if you have an application that doesn't understand UAC and doesn't request access to the administrative credential and just tries to run the commands, it would fail because UAC is still in effect. It just gives out that credential if someone asks for it. Whereas in Windows 7, UAC, you could actually disable it. So there is a difference. You also never want to disable UAC. There are ways around it. There are things you can do in the registry to actually disable UAC. If you turn off UAC in Windows 8, you cannot access Windows Store applications. UAC is a requirement for those applications to run. So in a summary, you won't see UAC if you're logged on as a built-in administrator account. However, when you have normal accounts and they have administrative privileges, you are going to see those UAC prompts. And remember, most of your management will be done from a Windows 8 machine. We are not logging on locally to Windows Server 2012. So you need to remember to shift right-click and run as administrators.